going to step into Matthew this morning. We've been on quite a journey here, looking at Matthew's description of Jesus. Matthew is one of Jesus' 12 closest students while he was on earth. And you can think of this book and many other books in the Bible, and maybe even the Bible as a whole, kind of like a huge puzzle or a quilt that's formed of many, many different pieces, and yet it creates one large picture. And if you look at Matthew's picture of Jesus, the overall picture is of a king, not a power-hungry king, but a king who turns our images of what it means to be a leader upside down. Somebody who's humble and somebody who serves and somebody who puts other people first. Always this king that you've never even seen in human form. You know, that no other person has really been able to quite emulate this perfect leader, this loving leader, and his followers. So a king and his kingdom, but the perfect king and his followers. And that's the big picture. And so all these chapters and stories, they fit in and they form parts of that. And we're toward the last week. We're in the last week of Jesus' life in this narrative of Jesus, just before his arrest, his crucifixion, his resurrection. And so we're in those final moments, and Matthew is sharing some of these conversations and stories Jesus has been telling with his followers leading up to his death and resurrection. So some of these final moments he's spending with his followers. And the conversation more recently in the last couple of chapters, we're in chapter 25 today, has turned toward some things Jesus talked about. He said, you know, I'm going to go away for a while. And I'm going to come back at some point in time to Jerusalem and this temple, but I'm going away for a while. And his followers said, well, you know, how long? When? How are we going to know when you're coming back? And he gave them some general answers, but he was kind of vague. And then Jesus said, you know, until I come back, I just want you to stay awake. Well, what's that mean? What's it mean to stay awake? And so the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at different stories Jesus is telling his followers of kind of what they're supposed to be about and different focuses until he returns. And we're still waiting for that return, even at this point in time in history. Fast forward, 2,000 years almost from this point in time in history. We're still going about these things. We're still waiting. We're still looking forward to some of the things that Jesus was speaking about, even at this point in time in history, that Matthew's writing about in these final days before Jesus' death and resurrection. And so Jesus is explaining, here's what the focus should be. And last week we talked about one of the stories, and the main emphasis seems to be ready, because it'll catch you by surprise. And Jesus said before that, my coming, it's going to catch a lot of people by surprise. So be ready. And I think last week's story might have created even more questions than answers. And a lot of these stories, that's the way they work. And so as we step into this story today, if you're curious about last week's story, you can go online and listen to our discussion from last week. And then hopefully that's just one, we talked about a few things, but there's so many more questions that head different directions based on that. And today we get in another story where Jesus is saying, here's another piece of what it means to wait for me, but to stay awake and to be about the things you're supposed to be about if you want to call yourself a follower of me. So we'll step into another story today. If you've never attended here before, I like to ask questions and I like to get your answers and responses. So this isn't a lecture where you sit and you listen and you say nothing. I want to hear from you and I want to hear your thoughts as we're going through this. So I'm going to ask several questions this morning as we work through another story called a parable. It's a comparison story where Jesus tells a story and it's supposed to compare with something else. We'll talk about what that something else is in about 30 seconds. So we're going to walk into that journey today. And this story, I would say overall, it's about kind of being responsible till Jesus comes back. But what does that mean? Let's kind of walk into it and figure that out, maybe what Jesus is trying to convey in the next few moments this morning. This is how Jesus starts out. We're in chapter 25 and verse 14, and he says, "For it is just like a human about to go on a journey." I was talking with some friends here that I just met this morning who have gone on a big journey from Netherlands to the United States for 2 weeks. That's a big journey to a faraway place. And that's the subject of this story. Someone who's getting ready to depart, to travel to a faraway place, very different from the place they call home, very different from the people they call friends. And that's set up on this journey. And so to do that, we figure out in the next sentence, this person who's about to go, this person going on a journey, he calls his slaves to himself. So this is set back in the first century when many people throughout the Roman Empire owned slaves. It doesn't mean owning slaves is good. It's just the story that Jesus tells for the reason. So this person going on a journey, he's the master. He's the head of the household. He's the one that's in charge of these slaves and the other people in his family at that point in time in history. And it says he entrusted his possessions to them. He's going to give them something, then he's going to travel for an unknown period of time to a very far, far away place. It says, it is like this. So this story, it's supposed to compare to something, and that something is it, right? So what is it? And if you read back in the previous verses, you find out that the it is God's kingdom. God's kingdom. It's the quilt that this whole book of Matthew has been about. And we think of a kingdom sometimes, at least in America, from our cultural perspective, as a place. Like, I'm going to go to that place, that kingdom. Like the United Kingdom. It's a place. But when the Bible talks about a kingdom, it's not a place, it's a community of people. And it's the people who recognize that God is their king, and they follow him as their king. And so that community of people who allow God to rule in their life as their king, as they walk through life from day to day, they look to God as their king. That community of people is somehow similar to this story we're getting ready to talk about. And if you're part of that community of people, you consider yourself to be one of those people who looks to God and his rule in your life, then this story somehow is about you, perhaps, as well. So it's going to be related to that. God's kingdom, his community of followers, is related to this story about this master who leaves a lot of money and possessions in his slave's care. So now we're going to read into the story and discover some things about this story and maybe about ourselves in the process. So here's what happens next. It says, to one slave, the master gave 5 talents. What is a talent in our vocabulary? What do we think of a talent as being? This is the participation part. If I said, what are your talents, what would you say? Yeah.
Skills.
Your skills. That's a perfect word, right? Your skills. I've got these skills. Those are my talents. But we have to step into first century words and meanings. And so a talent in this culture, it's an amount of money, a large amount of money. If you would go to the next slide here, this is a weight. It's a 75-pound stone. And this would have been equivalent, this would have been a weight that would have been used at this point in time to measure out a talent's worth. In this story, we find out later it's of silver. So if you work out and you go to the weight room and you have 2 45-pound plates, it's just a little bit less weight than that. But think about those 2 45-pound plates being made out of silver, pure silver. And that's the amount of money that we're talking about. This is worth, one of those stones is worth 6,000 days' wages in silver. And the first person is given 5 of those stone weights worth of silver. So if you transfer this to our economy today, the first slave is given $4 million of his master's possessions. And to another one, it says he gave 2 talents, $1.6 million. And to another one, he gave 1 talent, only $800,000 today. It says, depending on each one's ability. Then he went on a journey immediately. The word immediately, it's kind of placed between this verse and the next verse, and so it's kind of confusing. We don't know in the Greek writings, the manuscripts that we have passed down, if it relates to the guy leaving on his journey immediately or to the reaction of his servants in the next verse happening immediately, or maybe both, but it's kind of a connector word that's in the middle, so I put it with both those phrases. So he leaves, and maybe he leaves immediately. And so his slaves are left with these large amounts of money. And I want to ask a couple questions here to help us get into the story. How does the master, according to these verses on the screen, how does the master decide how much money to give to each slave? How does he make that decision?
Their abilities.
Okay, it says based on their abilities. Yeah, okay. But who determines what their abilities are?
He does.
Yeah, we're going to make an assumption here. The master is the one who's determining what their abilities are. And remember, this is a story not just about a master and 3 slaves, but about everybody who acknowledges God as the ruler over their lives. And so maybe the master in this story isn't just the master, but maybe it's a comparison to someone else who would determine our abilities and who would determine our responsibilities. Did you have a comment?
Is his trust in them.
Oh, his trust in them. That's good as well. In fact, I'm going to get to that very next. Let's hold on to that. The master, $400 million, that's a lot of money, or $4 million, that's a lot of money. How many people have handed you a check for $4 million recently? Right? If somebody does, it means they have a whole lot of trust in you, right? Now, that's one of the things that this teaches us about the master. Whoever this master is, he has a lot of trust in these three slaves. Maybe he gives other slaves other sums of money. We don't know, but they're not the ones in the story, okay? What else does this action teach us about the master? Besides, he trusts. He trusts these people a lot. What else does it imply? If he hands them this. Yeah?
He allowed them to run his business.
Yeah, sure. Right. He's allowing them the opportunity to run his business. He feels comfortable enough to travel for a while, to get away, and just say, hey, why don't you all just take care of things here and manage this? I would say that actually is a lot of freedom, right? It's a lot of trust, but it's a lot of freedom, because he doesn't say, well, take this money out, and here's the plan for you. I've outlined the business plan for you, so if you would just do what I say. He's like, here's $4 million. Good luck. It's a lot of freedom, right? What would you do if you had that opportunity? What else does it teach us about the master? Anything else you can see? Yeah. He believes in them, right? He knows they are capable, apparently. He believes in their capability, their ability to do something purposeful, useful, beneficial with this. Yeah, sure, of course. Maybe it shows us, too, he's very generous, right? Because he could have given them a lot less, right? Very generous. And maybe even he's creative. Maybe he has enjoyed that entrepreneurial spirit and the opportunity to create in the past, and he's saying, I've enjoyed being a businessman because it's given me so much creativity. And so I want these people to experience a little piece of what I've experienced with this opportunity. And so we begin to get a little bit of a portrait, a picture of what this master's heart is like as a result from it. It says next, so each slave receives a different amount based on the power or ability that he or she possesses. Another thing that's interesting to keep in mind, if this, again, is a comparison between this story and the people who follow God as their king, what do we think about the power source for people who follow God? Where would you say as a follower of Jesus that your power, your ability comes from? You think it comes from you?
No.
I mean, maybe you could make an argument for that. You're born with certain, what we would say actually talents, right, in that context. You have certain skills, maybe. But maybe you're not the one who's responsible for that. Maybe it was genetics, or maybe it was God, or maybe you define that some other way. Yeah. But then there's also the side of it of Acts 1:8. Jesus is talking to his followers just before he leaves, right? Floats up in the sky, according to Luke's account in Acts 1. And he says, you'll receive power. It's the same word here for ability, when the Holy Spirit comes on you. And so maybe the Holy Spirit is a source of the followers of Jesus, the followers of God's ability. And maybe just like the master determined the ability of these slaves, it said, okay, this one can handle $4 million worth. Maybe the Holy Spirit, maybe God is the one that determines how much his followers can handle in life. And what types of responsibilities? Because everybody, all of us, reality is we have different kinds of responsibilities, right? Mine looks different than yours. And we compare ourselves with other people, but really each of us have important responsibilities. And they're different. And maybe the Holy Spirit is a factor. God is a factor in determining what kinds of opportunities come our way. There's just so many different side conversations and thoughts that these kinds of stories provoke. And that's the purpose of it. The purpose is for you to hear this story and then to reread it later or to talk it over with friends and say, I think there's more to this than I caught the first time. And you keep having, God keeps impressing more and more and more things on you from a short little story. And really, it's a miraculous thing that these stories have the capability of doing. So we want to find out what happens. And thankfully, Jesus tells us that next in the story. It says, immediately, the one who had received 5 talents, $4 million, went out and put them to work. That word work, it means he labored, like he gave an effort with them. He labored with them with the talents and earned 5 more. $4 million in addition. In the same way, the one with 2, $1.6 million, earned 2 more. But the man who had received 1 talent, the first 2, they went out, right? They went out into the community to do things, into the business arena, into the market, into whatever opportunities their creativity would allow. But the man who had received 1 talent, he went off. And the idea is away. Dug a hole in the ground. And he hid his master's money. He hid the silver. This is the word for silver in the Greek in the manuscripts in the New Testament. So I got a question for you. How do the different slaves respond to the responsibility that's given to them? How do they respond? What do you see? What do some of them do? Huh? I hear whispers, but I can hear most of this stuff in the back of the room, but if you're super, super quiet, I can't hear you.
They took the challenge.
They took the challenge. I like that word. They took the challenge. They said, immediately, like, we're taking action now. What a great opportunity. Let's go out and find some opportunities to multiply this. Yeah, sure. They took the challenge. But yes?
Well, the third one was either lazy
Okay.
or afraid, and it's the same thing.
I like that word, safe. Okay. She said the third one, seems like the third one was either lazy or was afraid. Those are 2 interesting words, but I think a lot of our responses are based on sometimes our laziness, but also sometimes our fear. And so we play it safe. I think both of those motives, either laziness or fear, can prompt a safe response, a hesitant response. And maybe that hinders us, maybe that holds us back. And so the first 2 slaves, they immediately go out and they take the challenge. Like you said, they seek these opportunities. And they make an effort to increase their master's resources. They say, we care about our master. We want his resources to increase. And so we're going to take the challenge. And the third one just says, well, for whatever reason, maybe, like you said, laziness or fear. And I think we'll get into a little bit of that as we read further down in the story. Basically hides his responsibility, hides the challenge, buries it, and just walks away. What do you think the third slave does for this period of weeks or months or years? The other ones, we know what they do because you don't normally earn $4 million overnight, right? So they're out, they're pretty busy. They're doing things to increase this. What do you think the third one does? Yeah.
I feel what he probably does is float under the radar. He does not want people to watch him.
Float under the radar. Yep. That reminds me. So I had a friend that worked in a furniture warehouse. This is not on the notes. This is very much off the cuff. I had a friend who worked in a furniture warehouse, and they would load trucks with pieces of furniture, chairs, sofas, things like that all day. And he worked with a coworker who had created this little hideout, like a cave with boxes of couches and chairs. And he would go, when no one was looking, he would slip away and just sit back there maybe for 20 or 30 minutes and just take a nap in the middle of his shift. And then, so the boss wouldn't come around too often and wonder where he was. Eventually he'd slip out and load a few more pieces of furniture. And then when nobody was watching, he'd slip away into that little cubby and just do nothing, right? So maybe that's what this guy does. He's just disconnected, maybe. Yeah. I mean, really, I think we could say whatever he wants, right? Who knows? The story doesn't say, but whatever he wants. Maybe he wants to take a vacation. Maybe he just wants to sit around all day and do nothing and be lazy. Or maybe he's got other priorities or whatever.
He didn't think it was important?
Didn't think it was important, maybe. Yeah, or maybe he just didn't like, putting an effort out into business or whatever. We really don't know. But there are other reasons and other motives. But, it says after a long time in verse 19, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. So he shows up and he says, all right, I'm back. I want to hear your report. How's this going to go? Well, we find out for the first 2. It says, the one who'd received 5 talents, $4 million, approached, presented 5 more, $4 million more, and said, Master, you gave me 5 talents. Look, I've earned 5 more. And his master kept saying to him, your translations in English don't pick up this, but the verb tense that's used in the Greek in these manuscripts of the New Testament that we have, it's a constant thing. And so it wasn't like he called him in and he said, good job, man, and he never said good job again. It was like he kept constantly praising this slave. He was so excited that he had taken this and turned it into $4 million more. It's like, that was excellent. Well done. You did a good job. You made so many good decisions. I can trust you. You're trustworthy. And he kept repeatedly showering praise on this slave. He says, you were faithful over a few things. And this is interesting. We'll talk about that in a moment. He says, I'll put you in charge of many things. And then he says, enter into the joy of your master. That's kind of an enigma. There's not a lot of explanation of what it means. What's it mean to enter into the joy of your master? I don't know. And we can go on different imaginary rabbit trails from there too. And maybe that's the point of it, to try to imagine what does that mean like to enter into the joy of your master. We also learned that in these parables and these stories, the characters often represent someone or something else in a real life experience or a spiritual experience. And so if this master is reflective of Jesus or reflective of God in the story, which often in Jesus' parables the master is, maybe this is going to teach us a few things about Jesus or about God and the way that he operates as well. Enter into the joy of your master. What does that mean? I don't know. Yes?
I thought kind of parallel that to over in James being.
Okay.
So I think there's a maturity.
I want to recap it real fast so we don't lose people who are listening online real fast, and I'll let you finish up here. So basically he said that, maybe the talents and the implication behind this is that we're supposed to be doing God's word or putting it in practice in different ways in our lives instead of just hearing and listening it. He was comparing it to kind of a community of people where, some people are actively doing things, maybe sharing their faith with people or just engaged in service in different ways, and other people are kind of disconnected, and then one day there's accountability for that, or the master, shows up and, what do we have to show for it, that kind of thing. Is there anything you want to add to the end? I wanted to summarize you so that people who are listening online, would get that. So any other thoughts from you? I just didn't want to cut you off. So, okay. All right. And so these kinds of things, again, these kinds of thoughts are swirling around in our minds, and it's good because we're supposed to think, well, what does this mean for us as a result of that? Leroy?
An upgrade in your lifestyle.
An upgrade in your lifestyle. In what way? Tell me what you mean by an upgrade.
He's a slave.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's a good observation. So Leroy says, entering the joy of your master, maybe that means kind of an upgrade in your lifestyle. Things are going to get better from here on out, right? Maybe in this culture it means being set free, being given your freedom, or just welcomed into that family. And maybe your status doesn't change, but the way that you're treated changes, or responsibility, or we don't know. But there's a change, and that relationship changes. So that's a good observation as well. And so everyone's giving reports, and one person says, I made 5 more. And the master responds, and he's praising him, he's encouraging him, he gives him this reward. And we're learning things about the kingdom of heaven, about the people who recognize God as king in their lives as a result of this, or at least we're supposed to be, and making some connections. But I want to ask the question again here, what is the response of the master to these first 2 slaves? What does it teach us about the master? We learned some things about the master in the beginning with the gift that he gave, or the amount that he entrusted these slaves with. But what does his reward tell us about the master?
He respects them.
Okay, he respects them. And kind of what Leroy was saying, he wants to improve their life. They get an upgrade in their life. He wants to do that. He has their benefit in mind, sure. Any other things that you would learn about the master, his values, his heart, his response? Yes?
Well, the master joined us, right?
That's a good comment as well. Enter into the joy of your master seems to, as Jim is explaining, maybe have implications that this is creating joy for the master, right? The master has had these joyful experiences, but even the response of these first 2 faithful slaves, this is creating additional joy. So there's celebration on the master's part of what's been accomplished. We also see that this master, he's offering continual praise. Like, that's kind of his default. He wants to find reasons to praise these people. And they're slaves. And in the Roman Empire, it would have almost been unheard of to think about how important it was to praise your slaves. Even in more recent history, praising slaves is not a common thing. Slaves are considered as less than human in many cultures, or just as tools to carry out tasks, and not as important people made in God's image. And this master is praising a slave, and that's something very, very unknown in this world. He's prizing goodness. He says, you were a good slave. You made good decisions. Maybe that has to do with his character as well. Who knows? Good is a broad word. Has a trusting heart, and he has vast resources. He says, I put you in charge of a few things at first. If $4 million is a few things, think about what the resources of the master would be, right? So what's going to get put under this person's care next? I mean, it's mind-blowing. We can't even imagine what kind of resources this master has. So maybe there's something inside of that for us as well. So they get repeated praise and they get rewards, even though their responsibilities differ. They still get the same. And if you look at how the master responds to each of the first two, even though one had 5 and the other one had 2, the response is identical. And maybe that says something about how God responds to us who have different responsibilities and different, perhaps, giftings, different empowerments as well. Maybe it's not so much what we're doing, but how faithfully we're doing it, how our heart is going about it. Maybe those things are truly important. We'll wrap up by looking at the third servant, slave, and how things differ significantly with him. In verse 24, it says, the one who'd received 1 talent also approached and said, Master, I know you. And the implication here, it's another thing that in the Greek language, it doesn't transfer into English today super well. The implication behind that word is, I know you because I've been interacting with you for some time now. Like, I've been a slave of yours for years, and I've gotten to know you. He says, I've gotten to know you. You're a harsh man. Now, from everything you've heard about the master in the story so far, would you say harsh is a good word to describe the master? You know, it makes you think, where's this guy coming from? He says, you're a harsh man. You reap, you harvest where you haven't planted, and you expect to gather where you never even planted seed. Unless you work in a farming community, these are kind of different metaphors that we don't, experience all the time, or different symbols, imagery. But he's saying, you expect a field to grow something where you don't even plant seed. You've got pretty high expectations, mister. He says, so I was afraid of you. Where have you heard that word afraid this morning? Remember when Deborah talked about that earlier? Maybe fear is something that's at play here. Maybe. And I went off and I hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what's yours. To me, that last statement seems kind of like disconnected, right? Kind of uncaring. It's like, hey, what did you expect? You gave me this, here it is. What an odd response in comparison to the other two. Why does he bury $800,000 in the ground and just walk away? He doesn't accept the challenge. He throws away an incredible opportunity. And I think I land on the same places that Deborah landed on. Maybe he was afraid. And if he was afraid, it's almost like he reimagined his master. Like he thought his master was someone who his master clearly was not. And he was so convinced, like, I know you. I know who you are. And because I'm convinced that you're this harsh person, I was afraid. So it's like he defined his master different than reality. And he responded based on that. And maybe there are times where some of us have created these ideas about God. Well, God's a harsh God. He's here to punish me. He's focused on all my flaws and failures. And like if I try for him and I mess up, he's just going to get angry at me again. So why even try? Instead of taking risks, I'm just going to sit back and do nothing, because if I do nothing, at least he doesn't have anything to be angry with me over, right? And maybe we've done that. We think God is someone who he is not. And this slave thought his master was someone who he obviously, from the story, was not. Maybe it's that. Or maybe it's the other option. Maybe it's laziness. And because this slave is lazy, he just creates a story to justify it and says, well, you're a harsh person. You know, I know what you would have done. You would have been harsh. So maybe he's not really afraid. Maybe he's using this as kind of like a cover story. I was afraid of you, so that's why I didn't do anything. But in his heart, he just really didn't want to do anything and wanted to do his own things. Those are a couple different options, and we don't know which option is correct. Or maybe it's something else. But that's kind of where the story leads us. But for whatever reason, he just hides it. And then the master reacts, says he replies. He says, you evil, in this translation, really just as the word bad, could mean bad because he made bad decisions or bad because he had bad motives. We don't really know. You bad, lazy slave. Lazy means unwilling, so maybe he's just lazy or maybe he's unwilling because he's afraid, but he doesn't want to do his master's business. He says, if you knew with absolute certainty that I reap or harvest where I haven't planted and I gather where I haven't scattered, if you knew me so well, you should have deposited it with the bankers. You should have placed it with the people who lent out money in this culture. And at least I would have received it back with interest when I returned. Which is something to think about. If he was really so afraid, wouldn't you do something that would get you like the least risk possible, the least challenge possible, but so you'd have something else, to give this person that you feared, right? I want to have something extra. I don't want to lose anything, but I want to have a little extra. So why didn't he put it on deposit? Why didn't he at least put it in the bank?
He was stupid.
Maybe, I don't know. June's going to shoot straight with us. Like, maybe he just, the brain wasn't firing on all cylinders. Or maybe he was lazy. Or maybe he truly was afraid. But for whatever reason, he didn't do anything with it. And so the master's response is, hey, take it from him and give it to someone who's going to step up to the challenge, who's going to carry out my business with what they have. So he reprimands him because he made bad decisions. He had illogical confidence. He was so confident that his master was a harsh person. And the master's like, this doesn't make any sense. And then he's unwilling to put any effort into his master's business for whatever reason. He's like, I'm just going to take this privilege away from you. And then Jesus sums it up, and we'll sum it up with this. Here's kind of his point. He says, for everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an overabundance. But for the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. So that's kind of vague, Jesus. And I have to admit, after thinking on that sentence for some time, it still is a little bit confusing. But I kind of tie it into, somehow it's getting at this idea of being responsible with the things that we have. So maybe we got to chew on Jesus' point here that he seems to be summarizing in verse 29 a little bit. But that's his summary. And then he has this, have you ever watched a movie and you get done with the movie and then your friend, they poke you on the side and they say, don't get up, don't leave yet, because there's a scene at the end of the credits, right? There's a post-credit scene. Some people call it a credit cookie. It's like this little clip at the end of the movie that shows you something else. There's going to be a sequel, another movie, and this leads into that. Or it's just some comedy scene. Like the Avengers movies had some of those where these people are just sitting around a restaurant in New York City eating food and stuff, and joking around. And maybe it has something in it connected to another plot. But Jesus, after he makes this conclusion, he has sort of a post-credit scene here. Verse 30, he says, and throw this good-for-nothing, the idea is useless or unnecessary slave, into the outer darkness, which is the darkness outside the master's well-lit household or estate, where there will be weeping. There's going to be sadness there, and gnashing of teeth. Gnashing of teeth, we talked about, that's an idiom. It's a word image at this point in time in history. And an image is a snarling animal like a wolf or a dog that's kind of thing. And so the idea is there's anger or rage or hatred or danger, this desire to harm connected with that. So he says, outside my household, outside this well-lit, well-provided for area, there's sadness and there's anger and there's rage and danger and hatred, and that's what you're going to experience. He doesn't tell us anymore based on that point. But that's how he ends the story. And we're left with, what does this mean for the people Jesus is talking to in the audience? Who he's telling details about what it means to be a part of his kingdom. The people who look at him as king, who look to his rule in their lives, who follow him with their decisions and their lives. What does this mean? And then also, as we look at this, what does this mean for us as people at a different point in history, who perhaps are also trying to follow God as their king or Jesus as their king in life? And maybe some of the things that we learn are some of the connections that we made today. What is this master like? What is God like? What is our responsibility now? What is that privilege like? What is that challenge like? What causes us to hold back? Is it fear? Is it laziness? Is it something else? And maybe we see a little bit of ourselves in that story as well. And maybe that's the point. But being responsible is putting what we've received from God to work in his business, whatever we've received from him. And every one of us in this room have a little different allotment. We've received a little different skill or talent or amount or number of resources or heart. But it's about taking the challenge, really, with what we've been given personally. And that's what the report is about. And the master's response, perhaps it's the same for everyone in the end who's been faithful with those things. But what about if we disregard it and we let fear rule us and we let laziness rule us? What then? And the parable leads us to think about that as well. Let's go ahead and close our time, and hopefully, again, this creates a few more questions even than answers in some ways. And that's the point, to keep discussing and thinking about this over and over, to learn more things about God and how his kingdom works.